Former federal prosecutor Elise Adamson, CNN political commentator Shermichael Singleton, and former Democratic Congressman Joe Crowley. Welcome to you all. Shermichael, let me start with you.
Yep.
And you heard how Virginia Giuffre's family receives the word hoax when the president uses it. And it is a different thing to call the Russia investigation a hoax and how it's received by the American people, because it's so complicated to know those specifics. But there are millions of people across the country who have personal experience with sexual assault and sexual abuse, and they see these families on television. Is that ill-advised to call this, in any respect, to use that word a hoax?
Look, I think we all recognize the importance that at least 1,000 young girls were harmed, maybe even more that we are unaware of. I think it's why so many on the conservative right really want to know more about the case outside of what has already been publicly reported. I think, as Mark sort of tried to point out in his commentary when you asked a similar question, is that the president is attempting to distinguish the political side of this, which I think it's fair because there's a political component versus the side of the survivors being young girls who are now young women who are still going to have to deal with this for the rest of their lives. I think those are the two things that I think the president is trying to distinguish. And I would say there's some fairness in that articulation. This started with George W. Bush. We were talking about this in the back when Epstein got that sweetheart deal. Then you had Obama, nothing. Then you had Trump again, nothing. Then you had Biden, nothing. And here we go again. So you've seen presidents of multiple administrations that really didn't reveal a lot about this. And so at this point, Americans are wondering, well, why is that the case? Why did J.P. Morgan Chase, for example, Victor settle $200 plus $90 million with the survivors? And we don't know. This guy accumulated a significant amount of wealth. We don't know how. So there's some very valid questions to be asked. Again, there's a political component, but that certainly shouldn't usurp the real harm that was caused to those survivors.
Joe, speaking of the political component, Democratic Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley is calling for some of the survivors to be subpoenaed to speak, to testify in Congress. How do they navigate this appropriately, carefully, without over-politicizing this?
Well, first of all, I do think this is a problem the president created himself in terms of his campaign, setting up this problem for himself when he got into office and not release the information. So let's put that on the table as well. I do think that the president's use of hoax, for instance, is insensitive. And it's interesting to follow other words that he's used in describing these victims, saying that she was stolen from me to Epstein. So I think the president really needs to be more conscious of the words he's using. In terms of Democrats, I think sensitivity, I think compassion is important here in dealing with these victims of a vicious, vicious crime. Unspeakable crimes that took place to these women, many of whom were underage at the time, statutorily raped. There was no consent here that's legal.
Yeah.
And so I think Democrats have to be careful here. I think Congresswoman Pressley is right. We have to have more information. I think all of us have talked about the lack of participation by the victims. And when there are thousands, it's hard to imagine that they're not there. But we also talked about the fact that they've been traumatized. Yeah. Many of these folks were people that, and maybe you want to talk to that more yourself.
And I want to come back to participation in a moment. But the DOJ has a deadline that's coming up to respond to the letters written by these Epstein and Maxwell survivors. What do we need to know? What do they need to do?
I mean, in terms of their response, it's very similar to what Congressman Crowley just said. They're going to have to be very sensitive to this. So first, let's remember that some of these survivors weren't asking that the transcripts remain sealed. In fact, they were calling for transparency to end this re-victimization, because you said it right. The victims have continued to be re-traumatized as this case remains in the news cycle. I mean, these were minor children who were sexually abused, and they just want an end to this, and they don't want to be used as political pawns from either side. Yeah. And so I think in responding to their concerns, it's going to have to be very delicate. Obviously, the government does have an interest in having these transcripts released so they can give the public something, but they have to recognize how the victims are feeling in this case, or you would think they would recognize, because that goes back to that messaging problem. Yeah. So I'm curious to see how the DOJ does respond, because the messaging has been a bit clunky up to this point.
We've seen no evidence of the DOJ being proactive about listening to or trying to get the thoughts and feelings of some of the survivors. Caitlin Collins on her show earlier this evening had Annie Farmer, who is a Maxwell and Epstein survivor, and listen to what she said. This is a new element I had not heard before.
So far, there hasn't been a lot of official response, to our queries. Even in this, I reached out to the prosecutors who, who got the guilty verdict for Maxwell, saying, what's going on, and they knew so little because they have not been involved in this process. So I wrote a letter to Deputy Attorney General Blanche saying, these are my concerns about what's happening, and there has not been a response. So, I know, speaking with other survivors in this case, that even though so many politicians are talking about this, I don't think anyone has actually been contacted.
So you have survivors now who are trying to reach out to Todd Blanche, and they're not hearing back from him.
Yeah, I would probably advise to reach out to the survivors. I mean, you're looking at the political dynamics of this because there, again, is that huge political aspect. And I would say if I were advising the president, and I know obviously you probably want to protect him as much as possible because of how the president can message at times, I would say there's a unique opportunity here for our administration to be perceived by the American people as being an administration to finally bring justice to survivors for a case that goes back, again, all the way to George W. Bush. Victor, that's how long this has been lingering. And so why not bring in some of those survivors? I know it's been a very long time, but let's reopen this and let's talk about some of their experiences. And I don't know if that would legally be enough to start looking into some of these wealthy, powerful men, because I do believe that they're out there. But if there is enough, let's do that. And let's really try to put, as I think one person mentioned, these men behind bars by taking away the freedom that they took from those young girls who are now women. I think that's a powerful way for the administration to be perceived positively, I should say, by the American public.
But I think clearly there has been a quid pro quo. How is it that Maxwell, who was in a secured prison, is now at a camp? What transpired? That's further victimizing the victims because something clearly has happened. Information has been given and received, winks and nods. She's now in a cushy camp. So that is, again, if you're a victim, you're saying, what's going on? Yeah. She was a rapist. She was involved with child trafficking. She molested these children.
2 days, 10 hours of interviews of Maxwell, and she, Annie Farmer, can't get her call returned, and she's one of the survivors. At-lyse, Michael, Joe, thank you all.
Thanks, Victor.
All right, next.